Let's start. So, very nice to see everyone on a cold evening. I'm Kate Ross, I'm Senior Lecturer in History here at Bartlett. And it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Mario Carpo. Mario is a professor in architectural history and theory at the School of Architecture at Yale University, as I'm sure many of you already know. And he also has a professorship at the École d'Architecture de Paris-La Villette. So he's known really obviously for his research and publications into the relationship between architectural theory, cultural theory, history, and also particularly with its attention to the history of media and information technology. And his previous appointments are many and very varied and international. And in fact, Mario is about to start a visiting professorship in Yale. But previously, he's also worked in Canada and been head of the study centre at the Canadian Architecture Centre in Montreal, and also propelled a professorship at the Georgia Institute of Technology. This evening, I think he may well be talking in relation to his most recent publication, which is one of his most recent publications, which is The Alphabet of the Army, an MIT Press book. Previously, however, so you also will know that he is very well known for his award-winning book, Architecture in the Age of Printing. There were a number of us who suggested it would be very good to see Mario here at Bartlett. The Bartlett, as many of you I'm sure involved, is engaged in quite a range of digital practices and debates, and we thought that Mario's work would be very apposite for this kind of conversation, particularly because of the critical and historical commentary and discussion that he brings to this. And this critical and historical discussion is one which he has called techno-social, so it would be interesting to see how this comes out, but also because of the way that he looks at histories of matter and materialism, ranging from the digital, the numerical, the technical, and also obviously the biological, which will come up today. So, very warm welcome to Mario.
Thank you for the invitation, thank you for the introduction, and thank you in advance for your patience in listening to what is going to be an extremely boring paper. Chances are that I will fall asleep myself while reading it, which is why we have some gallons of coffee, just in case. You should notice some sign of sleepiness on my behalf. Bring some coffee and hopefully. But to go back to the introduction, it is, in fact, I would start from there. A couple of years ago, I published a small book, the small book you made reference to, The Alphabet and the Algorithm, where I recount the history of the digital turn in architecture from the early 90s, when, in my opinion, it started, to when I finished writing the book, which was in 2010. To make a long story short, in that book, I divided the history of digitally intelligent design into 3 stages or phases. First line, the age of form, of digital form making, the age of free form and of complex geometries. Second line, the age of standards, or rather the unmaking of standards, the age of digital non-standards. And the third period, the third line, which in my opinion started early in the years 2000, where the emphasis was on agency or the unmaking of traditional humanistic and modern authorship in design. And this is where, in my opinion, we still are. As digital authorship in general, and authorship in digital design in particular, meaning who makes what in a digital environment, are still, in my opinion, open experimental fields where plenty of exciting new things keep happening. Today, my topic is the second chapter, the follow-up to that story, a chapter which is not in that book, because these are things which happened after I finished writing that book, namely the more general challenge of indeterminacy in digital design and some of its theoretical and technical implications. What happens when designers decide to use the unprecedented potential of digital tools to delegate some design decisions to others, to many, to the crowds, or to random chance? And why should they do so anyway? Is design not about being in charge? Here, one problem, of course, is that we do not know what chance is, regardless of the tools we may use to represent it. And opinions on that matter diverge very much. But before we tackle this insurmountable philosophical issue, let me go back briefly to an easier topic, to the recent history of design theory, to see how and why indeterminacy came to play such a central role in today's digitally intelligent design. The story of a digital turn in architecture in the 90s is well known, and it has been told many times. We all know the protagonists. It is the story of how deconstructivism collided with early computer-aided design, spline modelers and animation software, merged with the Deleuzian fold, evolved toward globular shape and topological geometry, while riding on the wave of technological optimism of the 90s. Then crashing with it around the turn of the century. So far, so good. We know this story. With hindsight, however, and almost 20 years later, we can now perceive from a more distant vantage point the fragments of another story, which is today often forgotten, but which was vividly recorded in the literature of the time. Strange as it may appear today, in the early 90s, the digital turn was seen by many of its protagonists. I think of Greg Lynn, Stan Allen, Alejandro Zeirapol, among others. It was seen as a continuation and a reenactment, a vindication almost, of some ideas, not all, but some ideas, that architectural postmodernists had been advocating since at least the late 70s. Against the dominion of the mechanical age and of modernist standardization, postmodern philosophers and POMO architects alike had argued for differentiation, variation, and choice. Philosophers spoke of the fragmentation of master narratives. Architects spoke of radical eclecticism or the plurality of taste. But the spirit was the same. In the 70s, of course, there was no technological alternative to mechanical mass production, other than handmaking and pre-industrial craftsmanship, which indeed many POMOs then embraced and favored. But in the 90s, digital tools started to offer a viable technological alternative to industrial mass production and standardization. Digital tools can deliver just what the postmodernist had always wanted, but could never get at a reasonable price: variations. Variability is what digital tools can best make in all fields and areas, from physical objects to media objects, from text and music to shirts and shoes, to metal panels and part of buildings. The digital is about mass producing and customizing variations. In this sense, digitality was a technical answer to some cultural need and expectation of postmodernity. It was the technological supply that fulfilled the postmodern demand for variations. Within this general framework, however, postmodern culture also bequeathed to digital theories a number of less conspicuous, often unsuspected arguments, ideologies, and topics that one would not easily associate with a high-tech revolution. From the 90s to this day, digital theory in general, and digital design theory in particular, have been deeply marked by theories and beliefs of postmodern provenance and tinted by strong humanist, indeterminist, phenomenological, spiritualistic, or even vitalistic orientation. Computers and animism may seem unlikely partners, yet it is a fact that from the beginning, meaning from the 90s, and to this day, the adoption of digital technologies in design and making has been strongly influenced by a robust and pervasive irrationalistic ideology, and by a surprisingly strong anti-technological bias. Now, these are ideas, but ideas are better perceived if we see ideas embodied into people, particularly people we know or friends. So I will not mention names, but I can think of two persons I know well, and you probably know well as well, two gurus of a digital turn, two people who invented the digital revolution in the 90s. One of them never touched a computer in his life. And when he has to use a computer, he has an assistant to touch the keyboard for him. Another one, who is a good mathematician and a software engineer, in fact, I don't think he ever used the internet. He doesn't know what Google is. And when he has to buy a plane ticket, he telephones to a travel agent, and then he wants the ticket to be faxed to him, which is becoming increasingly difficult for him because travel agencies do not almost exist anymore, and fax machines are disappearing. So you see how difficult life is going to be for that man. But these are not technophiles. These are not people that are friends to technology. These are technophobes. And yet, they are in the books among the gurus, the visionaries, the interpreters of a digital turn. Now, let's go back to ideas. There is no time here to review all or even a few of these anti-technological theories, which mostly derive from, the names are up there, system theory, complexity theory, and from the so-called postmodern science of indeterminacy. In the 90s, it was common among designers to refer to this way of thinking as non-linearity. And Charles Jenks and Manuel de Landa must be credited for bringing this term to the attention of the design professions. Let me go back to one of the examples that were common at the time to illustrate this matter. Imagine a heap of sand. You could imagine a heap of sand even without a picture on the screen, but we must use pictures, so there is one. If we let each grain of sand fall from above in a steady, regular way, and assuming all grains are the same, the sand pile will acquire the geometrical shape of a cone. The angle at the base of the cone, which has a name, angle of internal friction, depends on the diameters of the grains, or granulometry, the materials of which they are made, their humidity, and perhaps something else, which can be calculated using a simple formula, which I studied when I was a student, and I immediately forgot, but it exists. As the grains keep falling and the pile grows, this angle remains the same, until at some point, one grain, only one, will provoke a catastrophe. The pile will collapse, and after some turmoil, a new shape will emerge and stabilize. As it seems, the point in time when the catastrophe occurs cannot be calculated or predicted, meaning that identical experiments, repeated as many times as you want, will always give different results. Likewise, each new configuration of the pile after the collapse will be different from all others, and none can be predicted. In short, the sand heap will at some point self-organize in an undeterminable, unpredictable way. Indeterminacy in this instance may mean two different things. First, the before bottom line, the sand pile is indeterminable, meaning we do not have the tools or skill to describe it properly, to model it fully, and to do all the calculation that we would need to predict its behavior. Or our observation tweak the object and influence its behavior, etc. This is the positivistic approach, implying that if we had enough science and computing power, if we had a team of NASA engineers and all the mainframe computers in the world, and we put them to study the sand pile for 3 months, then at some point they could predict the fall of the sand pile as effectively as we can predict the fall of this pen to the ground. After I drop it, of course. You cannot predict when I'm going to let it drop, but since I let it drop, we know what happens. So far, so good. But then there is another approach, which is the last line, which posits that the sand pile is inherently indeterminate, implying the sand pile is endowed with free will, and it may make decisions as arbitrary as any living, intelligent, and animated being. It may appear a long shot to many of us, but this way of thinking, called vitalism, is deeply embedded in some religions and in most pre-modern Western science. And many in the past, and to this day, including many people I know, and people probably you know as well, do in fact believe in the animation of the inorganic, as well as in magic and in many other supernatural things that cannot be easily proven with facts and figures. But there are other ways. They knew. Of course, the notion that computers at some point may acquire a faculty of will and become capable of choice is long established in the history of science fiction. For example, this was 1968, and you know what happened when you build a spaceship and you entrust it to a computer, and you call the computer HAL 9000, and then you come back and you tell the computer to open that door, which is what HAL 9000 did not do. But that was Stanley Kubrick, and that was 1968. In the 90s, the growing complexity of digital networks increasingly suggested and encouraged the notion that computers and the internet are indeed self-organizing systems, and that they may at times behave in apparently non-linear, indeterminable ways. This stands to reason, because the internet, for example, evolved from a military technology which was meant to do just that, to self-organize and reorganize randomly after some catastrophic destruction. Again, for most people, the indeterminacy of the internet was and still is just a metaphor, a strategy for the management of technological complexity. However, traces of a similar vitalistic belief in the animation of the inorganic, and particularly in the animation of networked technical systems, are ubiquitous in the digital culture of the 90s, sometimes taken literally, sometimes metaphorically. Some of this thinking is also reflected in the discourse and in the experiments of the 90s on what was then called cyberspace, hypersurfaces, virtual reality, and what Brian Massumi then called digital phenomenology, a digitally mediated, hallucinatory, and multi-sensorial alternative to physical space, as found, for example, in some coeval work by Lars Pruijbroek. That was 1997 or 1998, and that was the water pavilion, which still exists somewhere in the Low Countries. These are not renderings. They are not photoshopped. These are actual photographs, I was told, made inside the pavilion. Anyway, all this remained in the 90s a relatively marginal intellectual and cultural phenomenon. These were the extreme views of a group of radical thinkers and ideologues, although trendy at times, particularly in some circles. But today much more is happening. Yes, there is something going on next door. Can we? Perhaps another conference. Just 2 minutes pause. What was it?
Young people.
Oh, I see. Young students. Well, thank you. Okay, we were in the 90s. But those were the 90s. Most of the people in this, many of the people in this room were not born, but I was, and I remember these were indeed the 90s. Today, much more is happening. Today, many of those arcane theories have been largely vindicated by technosocial change, probably beyond the wildest expectations of those postmodern prophets. Postmodern philosophers, no names mentioned, tended to be vaticinatory, obscure, disgruntled, often apocalyptic. Today, their visions have been turned into reality by a bunch of high-tech startups and by a new generation of adolescent entrepreneurs, most of whom may have never heard the names of Gilles Deleuze or Ilya Prigogine. Technosocial change is as incremental as it is pervasive, so this bizarre development may have gone unnoticed. Yet it is a fact that indeterminacy is now a staple of our daily digital life, often tacitly accepted and taken for granted. Indeterminacy has already infiltrated many of our new technologically driven social practices, our economic behavior, even science. Whether we like it or not, we are all non-linear now, which might as well become the title for the next book by Bruno Latour. Again, there is no time here to discuss to what extent big data has brought non-linearity into our daily lives. But, for example, we all know full well that most media objects today live in a permanent state of random drift, and that it is increasingly difficult, as well as it is pointless, to try and freeze them in one single, authorial, authorized, stable and reliable shape or form. Who could have anticipated, only a few years ago, the rise of a new encyclopedia entirely written by its readers, where entries are offered by many, but by no one in particular, where all pages, or in fact, most pages, may be edited by anyone at will, and without any control, other than communal feedback or the wisdom of crowds. Yet Wikipedia works, often surprisingly well, while the good old authorial Encyclopedia Britannica in print has recently gone out of business. Another example, Gmail's original motto, search, don't sort, phased out a notion of classification and taxonomies, which was so ingrained in our minds that we would have thought it timeless and universal. The idea that we must sort and classify events in order to make sense of the world goes back to Aristotle. And a historian of philosophy could argue that without Aristotle's predicaments or genus, species, arborescent categories, there is no Western philosophy. If that is so, then Google is not Western, nor are its users. i.e. a large share of today's world population, which in fact, of course, is not Western. From the beginning of time, classification or sorting has been our tool of choice for information retrieval. We put things in specific places, following some order, so we know where to look for them when we need them. But Google is training us to leave documents unsorted, because digital search is now so fast that there is no need to manually pre-sort documents. This principle needs not be limited to media objects. It may be extended to physical objects of all kinds, which can be tagged and tracked using radio frequency identification. This may apply to random junk in a garage, to books in a library, or to the full inventory of Amazon.com. And in fact, items of all sorts in Amazon warehouses, including books, are not sorted based on subject or category, but only based on the frequency of sale, following an order which is perfectly meaningless to a human mind. Using the same technical logic, in our own houses, we could keep potatoes and socks and books and fish in the same drawers, or indeed anywhere. We would not need to remember where we put things or where things are, because whenever we need them, we could simply Google them in physical space. And the same Google logic needs not be limited to space. It may also apply to time. If every event that ever happened can be recorded, searched, and retrieved, in many cases, the search for an exact precedent may replace many other technologies of prediction, including modern science as we know it. Indeed, in many fields of predictive science, from weather forecasting to material science, information retrieval and digital simulation have already replaced the traditional analytic cause-to-effect approach of modern science. Many scientists have already come to the conclusion that sometimes, instead of calculating results based on functions and parameters, it is easier to assume that whatever happened before, if it has been recorded, and if it can be retrieved, will simply happen again. And this is not unlike what Galileo and Newton thought, but they did not have big data. In fact, often they had very few data indeed. In a sense, Western science as a whole was a cultural technology, or can be seen as a cultural technology developed to cope with a chronic shortage of data. As the data we could store and process in the past were not many, we learned to use abstract formulas and mathematics to extrapolate and generalize patterns from the few data we had. But as we now have access to more and more data, paradoxically, we need fewer and fewer calculations. If we can find the exact precedent to the event we are studying, we do not need numbers and formulas to compare, generalize, and extrapolate patterns from a limited record of a few similar accidents. In short, it seems safe to conclude that in many walks of life, and of science too, the old cause-to-effect, deterministic, causalistic approach which we used to take for granted, at least to predict the behavior of the inorganic world, has already been replaced by a new, postmodern, and post-scientific method, which is not based on cause-to-effect determination, but on probabilism, statistics, and increasingly heuristic and holistic processes. More and more often, we do not calculate, we search and retrieve. And more often, we can better deal with a complex system as a whole than with the simpler mechanical logic of its parts. Regardless of any ideological or cultural stance, some of these developments are already reshaping our approach to design and more. We may or may not be aware of the cultural provenance of these ideas and beliefs, or of their vast philosophical implication, but that is irrelevant. This seems to be simply the way many of today's digital tools work best, at least in our present cultural and technological environment. And if we use these tools as we do, we cannot avoid some of this technical logic. Hence, not surprisingly, some of these developments are already reshaping our approach to design. Let me review briefly a number of scenarios and design strategies that share, I think, a similar indeterminist inclination, and which are becoming increasingly frequent among today's digitally intelligent designers. Case number 1, what I call the Wikipedic style of many hands. In a Wikipedia-like design environment, objects are made by many, but by no one in particular. The object of design is forever drifting, like a Wikipedia entry, permanently open to interactive editing and participatory versioning. Hence, objects are never finished and can never be entirely reliable or fully functioning. For Wikipedia, this is not a problem. For a design notation, it is a problem because this mode of making is unsuited to building, as buildings must be built at some point and they cannot change much after that. Yet the logic of building information modeling and of integrated project delivery, or IPD, is very close to the collaborative spirit of this game. Indeterminacy and open-endedness, in the case of BIM, are mostly limited to design notations prior to building, which is pure information. But they could, in theory, extend to the functioning life of the building, which must be maintained and taken care of after it has been delivered and built. Case number 2. This picture was taken not far from here at the AA almost 10 years ago, the picture at the bottom. Generative evolutionary scripts. Parametric scripts can be instructed to generate random variations, which are then automatically selected based on the feedback deriving from a chosen set of data, from patterns of use, for example, or from some material conditions or whatever. The whole process thus emulates and almost reenacts Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, based on a first phase of random variation and a second phase of elimination of the losers and survival of the fittest for each given environment. In the 90s, designers often refer to the morphogenetic theories of Darcy Thompson in a similar context. More recently, digital design theory has largely adopted the terms of emergence and self-organizing systems, in turn derived from postmodern system theory. This mode of product evolution by automatic selection is current in the design of many media objects, and famously in the case of web design, where this strategy is practiced under the understated and misleading name of A/B testing. In A/B testing, design choices are made by trying out two versions of the same interface or website and comparing user data. When a new version, the B version of a website, works better than the old one, the A version, for example, because users stay longer on the page or click on a link more often, then the change is automatically adopted. Variations used to be introduced by human beings, by actual designers, but in most cases they are now randomly generated. In this case, the system self-organizing by accidental mutation and environmental feedback or natural selection, as in Darwin's model of biological evolution. The same form generates many random variations, and the one that happens to best fit a given environment, the stronger form, survives, to the detriment of all the others that are killed. A variant or a variation of this, case number 3, is often practiced by designers testing the material performance of a particularly unwieldy structural system. Typically, the anelastic or anisotropic deformation of non-standard materials may be too difficult, like a membrane, like that, may be too difficult to calculate analytically. And instead of mathematical calculations, designers must then resort to tests with physical models, often with mock-ups in full size. In other terms, the only way to see how this system will perform under stress is to build them and watch. This empiric approach to structural design is often called somewhat improperly structural form finding, implying that these systems will deform under stress to reorganize in macroscopic but unpredictable ways. And they will, in the end, stabilize by choosing a new form or shape, which some claim at that point is chosen by the object itself, meaning by nature. Fray Otto and Anthony Gaudi are frequently cited as pioneers of this method. The shape of a soap bubble, the deformation of a catenary rope, or of a batch of knotted linen hanging from a ceiling are said to be cases in point. For some, this mode of design is simply an opportunistic shortcut we choose when we prefer not to call in the engineers or we do not want to pay their bill. But for others, there are things in nature that even the best science cannot and will never predict. Time will tell. Case number 4. In cases less complicated than those just mentioned, however, digital simulation increasingly offer the possibility to test the performance of a given material system on the screen rather than in reality. Think of the easiest case of material resistance, elastic deformation, or thermal behavior. The visual feedback on the screen, as such in this case, is now so fast that the designer can keep tweaking the design and test it in simulation for as many times as necessary, meaning until the desired performance is obtained. The designer can thus optimize a structural solution by the simulation of repeated trials and error, rather than by predictive analytic calculation. And this is, by the way, not very different to what traditional craftsmen once did. The ideal craftsman is not an engineer nor an architect. Craftsmen neither design nor calculate. They just keep making and remaking an object until it doesn't break. And they learn, often tacitly, from this experience. Today, using digital simulations, designers can make and break on the screen in a minute more objects than a traditional craftsman would have made and broken in a lifetime. Designed by feeling and by intuition, designed by the gesture of the hand, which some call design by making, hence becomes a viable alternative to the analytic, predictive approach of modern science and of modern design. Examples could continue, but let me jump to a conclusion. Evidently, this is not design as we knew it. The pattern common to these disparate trends seems to be that increasingly we are redefining and limiting the ambit of design because we assume that some digitally empowered systems are capable to self-organize and can find the best solution by themselves, by aggregating the wisdom of crowds or by letting nature find its way. Both these solutions may be problematic for some of us. They are problematic for the design professions, of course. They also have vast philosophical, ideological, social, and political implications. Co-designing with nature, negotiating with, and even surrendering to nature's will and whim are timeless human ambitions, were defined in the industrial age by 19th century's Romanticism and by the various naturalisms and organicisms that followed in the course of the 20th century. And as we know, the quest for a renewed alliance with nature is a wiser and more urgent policy today than at any time in modern history. But in today's social and political environment, but prays for the invisible hand of nature, or for the invisible hand of the free markets, or of the financial markets, or of any other supposedly self-organizing system, means much more than that. Self-organization and digital Darwinism are perfectly reasonable design strategies, and in many cases, they just work. But let's not forget the bigger picture, because we already know what social Darwinism means, and we already know what social Darwinists have in mind. Thank you.
I'm not going to question, but I wonder if anyone else is very keen to ask the first question. I was very interested actually by how you finished with this warning about the utopian belief in a Darwinistic story of the digital. Because I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the socio-political kind of, not alarms, but ethics that might come into play, this bigger picture. And you kind of, your sort of closing comments where you hint at the need to not just romanticize these new democratic or changes in architectural authorship. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, what is that? No. What is it represented?
It's that.
No. What kind of environment is that?
Jungle.
That's a jungle. I would say that is a jungle, or at least I found it by Googling jungle in Google Images. So I presume jungle must be the title of this painting by Rousseau and Duvalier. Now, the jungle is a self-organizing system, because you see, these animals find a way to self-organize. So the lion is eating, what is it? An antelope? The lion is eating something else. But lurking in the background, there is a big cat, which is probably a tiger. So when the lion is done, there's the other animal waiting. So that is the jungle. That is why the jungle is a self-organizing system, which is probably the reason why most of the time we do not in the jungle. We build cities as an alternative to the jungle. Now, we all know that sometimes when we study urban stuff, or when we design urban stuff, at some point it makes sense to study the city as a self-organizing system. Because cities sometimes work in a self-organizing kind of way. And it is a perfectly viable and in fact absolutely functional analytic tactic and even design strategy to study the city as a self-organizing system. But let's not forget the bigger picture, and let's not misunderstand the metaphor with the reality. The city is not a self-organizing system. The cities do not grow like mushrooms from nature. We make cities, nature doesn't. So we organize cities, not nature. Mushrooms are self-organizing, cities are not. And so, even though we often study cities as self-organizing systems, and we design sometimes self-organizing patterns inside cities, and it's a perfectly fine strategy, so long as we remember that it is a strategy. It is not the reality. It is just in the case of, of a sandpile. Sometimes it makes sense to study the sandpile as if it were a self-organizing system. But let's not forget, the sandpile is not like my cat. It cannot make decisions. So let's keep this, because otherwise, if we misunderstand, if we overlay the metaphor with reality, then we know where we start, but we do not know where we end. Social Darwinism is a dangerous political theory, because humans do not do that to one another, and some people think they should.
Okay, thank you. I've got more questions, but I'm sure there are other people who want to ask questions of Mario.
I didn't want to go into this political stuff, but you...
Oh, well, I'm sorry, I think it's important. I mean, okay, so I'll add another question which links to your question, which is that Anton Kikon talks about the need for restraint, that is a positive element of the discussion about the digital today. And he talks about it particularly with its relationship between this affiliation between the digital and the Darwin and the ecological evolution. The notion particularly dealing with climate science and the whole way in which sustainability and environmental questions are being dealt with by designers. So he uses this notion of restraint. So I don't know if you're...
I think restraint is always a good thing, particularly in France.
Anyone else wants to ask questions or comments? Yeah, Ian.
No, really just a comment, for an observation about one of the comments you made about time and Google. You were saying that, if, to some extent with Google we can or might be able to instantly recall facts and information from the past, and we can recall things that have happened in, almost everything that's happened recently in the last few years. It seems to be your comment. Two things that occur to me about that. One is that I'm not sure that is the case, because one of the things that the history of technology tells us over the last few years is that actually the technologies disappear, so that we already have computer programs that we can no longer run because we don't have the hardware. And there are still the cases that libraries are relying on printed copies of things because they don't rely on the digital format still being available. But also, I suppose that was just kind of an observation. I wondered what your thoughts were about this in relation to history. And, as someone yourself who has obviously done lots of historical work, whether you feel that for some of the speculations you've made about these kinds of technologies in relation to design, whether you feel this changes our relationship to historical documents or even the writing of history as a practice. That's a very large question, but it was one of the things that occurred to me as you spoke.
Very large indeed. The reference I made to using Google instead of scientific tools, it was about predictive sciences. So in the case of a Weber pattern, well, there was a picture with a Weber pattern. And in that case, the different approach between the analytic Galilean Newtonian approach and the Google approach is quite clear-cut. In the old way, the way we studied at school, you take a unit of air, which has a certain amount of energy, described by temperature, pressure, humidity, etc. And then you calculate mathematically the point of condensation. Using that system, meteorologists used to tell it is going to rain at a certain point in time and in space, and it never worked, as we know. And recently, they are in fact increasingly switching to another way. They analyze morphologically the weather pattern. And when it looks the same, then they assume that it will evolve in a similar way. So the analytical calculation is phased out. Search and retrieval of precedent is really Google instead of Newton. Google instead of science. And of course, mathematicians are perplexed and they say, we do not know what this means, but if it works as a tactic, as a strategy, why shouldn't we use it? So this is the point I was making. Your question was another.
Well, this is more of a wider speculation, therefore, about what this might do for history. Did not think about predictive sciences, but disciplines which have tended to look backwards in time. If we have a situation whereby potentially we can recall almost any information from the past, does that obfuscate or in some way reduce the necessity for histories which try and filter and narrativize events in the past?
That's a good point.
Do we know
all the history we know is again a cultural technology meant to obviate to the chronic shortage of data upon which our civilization has been predicated and with which we always have to cope. Meaning only very few data from the past could be recorded and transmitted. So we use historical construction also as a narrative to select those events which would be recorded and all the rest was forgotten. If we move to an environment where everything that happens is recorded and is retrievable, do we need more interpretation or do we need less interpretation? We need 15 or 20 years. But it is a good point. The same pattern, the shift from tradition predicated upon the assumption of a permanent shortage of data to a new one predicated on the utopian assumption that at some point all data will always be available. If this eliminates analytic, predictive, Galilean science, does it eliminate history in the Greek, Roman, Hegelian tradition? So that's big data, not to science, but to history.
Can I come in here? Can I come in here? Because I think one of the questions I also had was that really when you were talking about this shift from cause effect to this kind of database field of emergence, one of the things I think we've talked about certainly in the masters, and I've talked about my students, and I'm sure colleagues here have talked about, is the need for epistemology. That now, when you're working with this huge field of information, it's very important actually to return to conversations about epistemology, which in the 1990s, when you began the conversation this morning with the digital architecture, there was a sense that you didn't need to have a conversation about bodies of knowledge, where this knowledge was constructed and how it was constructed, and who was the author, and so on. So I don't know, do you agree with that, or are you also saying epistemology is now irrelevant as well?
We do not mediate with the wisdom of crowds, which some say is good.
So you, like parasols, used by...
Or the self-selective, the self-organization. I mean, Wikipedia is already good. And after all, let's make a vast organization. Democracies are wisdom. When we vote on a referendum, on a topic on which even technical, we have referendums in the UK.
To try not to differ. But Cameron has just said it.
Oh yes,
after they win the next election.
Well, there are small countries in Central Europe where they organize a referendum on technical things. For example, should we build a new hospital, a new atomic power station? To vote. Everyone votes, and it is one person, one vote. And one could argue, but you, the greengrocer, how do you know about, shouldn't the engineers, shouldn't the vote of the engineers have a coefficient multiplication? So when you vote for this power station, if you are an engineer, your vote is multiplied by 8. If you are an architect, it's multiplied by 2. If you are a greengrocer, it's multiplied by 0. No, it doesn't work that way. All votes count the same. Which in some countries seems to work.
Sophia.
Thanks for a very interesting lecture. I have two questions. I wonder how much this is a thing of the 90s, and how does it relate to what was going on since the 50s and the 60s? So, for example, we know that people like Gordon Pascal, Cedric Price, and the whole thing about cybernetics since the 50s. I've been working on similar ideas as a reaction to the early modernist ideas and as a sort of an inevitable response to post-war reconstruction and all the social issues that were very, very important at that time. So one question is this. The second question has to do with how much all these things actually are happening out there in the construction industry, in the practices, how much architects use them, and how much they are theorized or used in the design studio or are limited within a specific group of designers that are influenced by scientific models based on emergence and self-organization. So I'm trying to establish an understanding of how all the things that you point attention to, how important they are, how important it is to theorize things in order to project our agency and see whether we can influence in any way what is going on out there. It's actually really happening and we need to do something about it.
Concerning the timeline, yes, all the events that you mentioned are of capital importance, historically speaking, in the history of technology, in the history of postmodernism, and in the history of architecture. I generally tend to overemphasize the turning point of 92-93 for this simple reason. This is the time when computer-aided design started to become an actual form maker. So prior to that, it was about the decision process, it was about rationalizing, decision-making, etc., etc. And with the arrival of spline modelers in the early 90s, it became a user-friendly tool to just make shapes and forms on the screen. So for architecture, that was probably, I could argue, in the many turning points, that was one which I would rank more importantly than others, which is why I put that watershed higher than many others that occurred. For your second point, one important, I think, difference between this story in the 90s, Indeterminacy. In the 90s, it was there. It came from a long tradition of postmodern sciences of indeterminacy. And in the 90s, it was powered by the first experimentation with physicality. But one difference between the 90s and now is that in the 90s, it was a theory by visionaries and gurus, people that were trying to anticipate the future. Today, it is no longer a theory. It is a part of life. In the 90s, there were a few meta-pensées who had these ideas, and people could believe or could not believe and say, there are a bunch of loonies and they are there. And you could have said in the 90s, these things are just in books. Today, these things are not in books. They are in the tools that we use to organize our daily life. They have already started to change. It's not even technology anymore. It is popular culture. And it is, in a sense, even more problematic for us, because so long as it is a theory, we can relate to it in theoretical terms. Today, it is everywhere. It is a fact of life. It's like Starbucks. It's something we buy every day for breakfast.
In this country, for example, the government tries to move everybody to BEAM by 2016, and they are now have these levels, BEAM levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. They are now through level 2, and they are trying to work on the transition towards level 3. But there are still doubts regarding how the construction industry is going to move towards this direction, because we know that it's practice-led, and it's not. It's based on what they've been accustomed to doing all this.
This is an interesting pattern. BEAM has been developed in the United States under the auspices of the building and of the construction industry. Hence its technocratic, boring aspect. But recent developments indicate that in this country in particular, it has been adopted by the government. I don't know what it means.
It means 20% reduction of cost. When you take over the play.
Yes, but I hope that with adoption, BEAM will become a more flexible tool, because otherwise, no, BEAM was developed to be parking lots, and it shows. So let's go.
Your question back.
I have a question. I have a question about indeterminism. If it works the old way, like the example you gave with meteorologists, with the weather, if you could look at certain characteristics and say, because of these characteristics, I know what's going to happen with the weather exactly, and well, if it was really determined mathematically, do you think it would, if it worked that way, would it be possible somehow to discover, to know more about the future? Would we have technology to know what would happen in the future more generally, more, not like only in weather, but in other aspects as well? If it wasn't for indeterminism. So, you know what I want to say?
If we could predict the future, I would be doing another profession. Some people claim, well, the matter is, given the phenomena I described, there are two ways to relate to them. One is to say, we do not know why it works that way, but so long as it works, let's just use it. And then some people make a more theoretical argument and say, if it works that way, it means that nature is made in a certain way, which is improbable. In the etymological sense, it cannot be proved. It becomes at that point an argument. It's almost an argument of faith. People believe nature behaves in a certain way, and people believe nature behaves in another way. And each of these two approaches sometimes has a good great sense in predicting natural phenomena. But to date, no one has proven that one or the other, or any other approach, is right.
Luke.
Sorry, I was just going to ask you in relation to your point about the Amazon warehouses and also in relation to Google. What do you think is the implication of, although liberation might kind of exist on a personal level or on that kind of crowdsourced level, that these things are controlled by companies which kind of ultimately monetize them? And I guess the extension of that is also the proliferation of kind of the fact that if you're talking about these systems as essentially ephemeral things, but these companies also kind of maintain data centers which are now starting to account for something like 1 to 2% of the world's energy use. And what do you feel is the kind of implication of this data and these potential systems, and the fact that they are actually now, well, they are actually physically contained, physically sort of encapsulated in space by certain companies which own that space and own that territory. Therefore, something that seems to be quite ephemeral actually becomes only manifest in that way because it's kind of spatially owned by someone. And do you think there could be a kind of territorial rupture that might emerge between the sort of borderless conditions we see in the kind of digital sphere and the fact that Google has a fence on its data center which might be containing your personal data?
It is a vast field of, yes, Amazon is doing that for profit, as is Google, but the point is, until a few years ago, for the same profit, Amazon would have been using the newest system of decimal classification, or probably, but this being American, this is probably what we would have used, a system of arborescent categories. So each book has a number, and if you read that number, it locates that book on the general tree of universal knowledge. That's the way it works. 1, 2, 3, 9, every branch is a subject, and each number you add locates that book on a smaller and smaller branch of universal tree of knowledge. This is an idea of classifying knowledge, which was back to Aristotle, classifying books, which was invented in the Renaissance, when printed books began to be too many, and they started to have novels of putting them in places from where it would be treated. 10 years ago, this is what Amazon could have done. By the way, this is what libraries are still doing. But Amazon is not doing that. The new system of classification is closer to the central I/O of the items which are more frequently sold. so that the robotic arm minimizes the itinerary to retrieve the goods. When an item starts to be sold less frequently, it is put in a more distant part of the warehouse. This is an order which would not enable us to find entry at all, but for them it makes sense, and perhaps we will find another one. It is simply that classification, which used to be a part of our mind, so much embedded in our mind, but in the book, it is everywhere, it is in nature, it is forever. Well, in many cases, it has already been phased out. Yes, they are making a profit out of it, as they would have made a profit out of the Dewey system a few years ago. Of course, at some point, the universal retrievability of all data will become a political nightmare. But this is not our subject today.
Yes, I'm trying to understand what your argument actually is. And can I just ask my question? It's about your term social Darwinism. And are you arguing for more social engineering or less social engineering? If you understand that.
I am not arguing for social Darwinism, certainly. I'm describing digital Darwinism as a design strategy and tactic, as a tool of design.
Okay.
I made an analogy showing that this design tactic as a common platform with vastly overarching social and political theories, which evidently I do not like. But this is outside the topic of my of today's lecture. As far as emergence and self-organization are, as I described them, design tools or design strategies, they often simply work. So it makes perfect sense, I think, to use them. But I ended with a cautionary note by indicating that they pertain to a vast field, by analogy and probably a little bit more than that, where perhaps some working concerning the philosophical implication of these tools needs to be hidden. And this is where I will stop.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll end with Jonathan's question.
I enjoyed your talk, and when you were talking, I was thinking about there's a text, Sanford Anderson text in the 1970s, when he talks about early functionalism, and I think I found a lot of the time that the rhetoric that's associated with digital architecture at times it quite mimics sort of early functionalist rhetoric, meaning to a sort of deterministic manner. And one of the things that's very interesting that Anderson said is that if you look at the early functionalists, actually they weren't really functionalists. They weren't literal functionalists. They were metaphorical functionalists. And the title of the article is Fiction of Function. And I wonder whether I wonder what you would feel about the fact that if I said that now we have a sort of fiction of emergence or a fiction of addition.
Yes, absolutely. This is a very good point, and one which would have been the next chapter if I had, written a longer paper. But so far so good. We know what self-organization and emergence mean as design strategies. We know how they work. Some people use them. Good. Then there is another story. Many of our friends, designers who like, some of my old friends, oftentimes build objects which represent metaphorically a certain idea of indeterminacy, through symbolic association and even stilistical choices. Sometimes actually unrelated to the design tools they used to produce them. It is just a representation or a metaphor or a style. Now, there are people that were functional in fact and functionalistic in style, or in, metaphorically, just as today there are people who use self-organization and they try to camouflage it, not to show it. And there are people who do not use it, but try to represent it. Because there is a certain aesthetic of self-organizing system. There is a universe of forms, as an art historian would say, which is associated with that field, and some of our friends are actually using it. Sometimes in accordance with what they do, sometimes not. It is just in the spirit of the time. And we create forms, and forms that symbolic associations. We cannot deny that. We should be aware of that. And sometimes forms speak a certain, they represent a set of values, which sometimes are reflected in the way the object is made, and sometimes are not. This always happened in the history of architecture, so why should it not be happening now? But it's good to remember that it is also part of it. Yes, thank you.
I think we'll end on the story of games architecture and digital conversations, but we can all take that away to the next level. So thanks very much, Mandy.